Make me your villain.
Me and the devil walking side by side. Me and the devil.
Welcome to the Daily Allegory through astrological divination. Imagine getting pulled into a Ponzi scheme and getting promised money by somebody to do something. Help them attack and assault somebody, possibly stalk them, do odd things for some change, if you will. And then not get your money. It's not ever going to come. Today's story is about a ruthless woman at the center of a sprawling scam who promises payouts to a network of accomplices after they help orchestrate an elaborate takedown of a man they expect to break easily, thought was an easy target, and thought was alone. Framing him through identity theft, forgery, asset theft, and a campaign of psychological warfare built from stolen military weapon methods weaponized by corrupt insiders who abuse their positions to manipulate the courts, the community, and public perception in hopes of driving him into prison, madness, or death for profit. Can you imagine what kind of person would do that? They'd probably hide behind Christianity, I assume. But the operation begins to rot from the inside when the target refuses to collapse. Despite years of torture, threats, coercive control, and attacks aimed even at his children, could you imagine? He endures, adapts, and quietly turns the trap inside out, playing along just enough to keep his enemies confident while running a counter psy-op of his own, feeding them distractions, watching them overplay their hand, and luring them deeper into exposure as an unseen ghost squad of elite hunters shadows the game in secret, protecting his life and documenting every move until what began as a criminal conspiracy to erase one man becomes the making of one of the most devastating cases the East Coast has seen in years. Today's story is called The Ghost Case, and it is quite an interesting concept. If it were real life, it'd be kind of insane. That many people on one person, and the person not getting taken down. What an ultimate slap in the face that would be. They had all been promised money. She promised many things. That was how the girl kept the machinery moving. Through whispers, percentages, 20% probably, future payouts, the glittering lie that once the man was broken, arrested, declared unstable, ruined in court, and memory and name, there would be more than enough for everybody. Much, much more to go around for everybody. She promised slices of a life not yet stolen. Assets, titles, accounts, property, access, sympathy, status even. She promised the aftermath as if it were already banked. And because greed is easiest to recruit when it's dressed like inevitability, people gathered around her in layers. False friends, counterfeit witnesses, forged documents, frightened cowards with rented courage, opportunists in uniforms they had no rights to dishonor, and men who had once stolen techniques from places where secrets were never meant to survive the theft. What they built out of those stolen methods was not merely a scam. It was a campaign. A Ponzi scheme. A sophisticated psychological war designed to make one man disappear without ever needing a clean crime scene, pushing him towards arrest, pushing him towards madness, pushing him towards death by force. As if all else failed, push the world to believe he had done it to himself. So it appeared to be an accident. The girl called it strategy. The others called it business. The man called it weather. That was the part that began to terrify them first. He didn't react correctly. He should have collapsed under the weight of it all. The identity theft, the forged records, the false stories seeded into the community, the legal theater, the whispers slipped into court corridors, the constant pressure campaigns, the threats against his children, specifically the oldest. The slow and methodical coercive control designed to make reality itself feel almost untrustworthy. Like they were trying to make somebody appear like they had paranoid schizophrenia. The attacks came in waves over years. Some were obvious. Some were so subtle that they can only be felt in the body before they were ever named in the mind. They pushed him from every side imaginable. Socially, legally, financially, psychologically. The objective was not just destruction, it was authorship. They wanted to write the endings themselves and force him to die inside of it. But the man refused to move like prey. That kind of made them sloppy. At first, they mistook his refusal for ignorance, then denial, then stupidity, then shock. They kept waiting for panic to bloom inside of him, for rage to overtake his judgment, for one desperate mistake to validate the portrait they had already painted for the public. Instead, he adjusted, kept breathing, kept walking. Like Dory from Finding Nemo, he just kept swimming, na 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 na. He took the pressure and somehow converted it into absolute stillness. It was almost like he was a chaos alchemist. A stillness so unnatural it began to feel like surveillance. He made the best of conditions meant to destroy him. He laughed at the wrong times, stayed calm where a lesser man would have begged, seemed to notice things that he shouldn't have noticed at all. And after enough failed attempts, the group arrived at the possibility none of them wanted to voice out loud. What if he knew? I mean, he did. But from their perspective, what if he knew? Not the whole architecture. Not yet, just enough to understand. Enough to ruin timing. Enough to survive what was designed to be unsurvivable. Enough to make their elegant operation feel watched from the inside. And it was. Every poke, every pry, every engineered event, every tech hack, every fight, every reactive abuse-based situation. All of it. The girl responded the only way that she knew how. Naturally, she escalated. That's what she was taught. Let me use the right word. More pressure, more promises, more people pulled in, more forged papers, more rehearsed testimony, more panic disguised as confidence. She kept telling them the payout would come. She kept feeding everybody just enough hope to keep them participating in their future indictments. Those closest to her began to sense something rotting beneath her certainty, though. But by then, they were in way too deep. They had played heavy roles. They had lied way too loudly. They had signed a little bit too much, said too much, carried too much of the plot in their own hands. The promised money had become less important than the need for the story to hold. I mean, without the appearance of the narrative consistent with the story, questions might come from third party and people outside of the scenario. They might have questions because it doesn't add up. If the man survived with his mind intact, they were not merely unpaid, they were exposed. What none of them understood was that while they were trying to drive him insane, the man had quietly began running his own operations. Not against them at first, around them. Hammer and anvil style. He learned to perform weakness when weakness bought him room. He let them think he was isolated when being underestimated made them careless. He fed certain narratives without confirming them. Withheld panic where panic was expected. Staged just enough confusion to keep their focus on the wrong windows while something much, much larger was moving behind the walls. He sold them his role so convincingly that even those closest to him could no longer tell where the suffering ended and the strategy began. It was a dangerous kind of theater. One wrong beat and he would lose his life for real. Actually could have died. He was live bait. But he understood what the girl did not. People who believe they are winning always widen their movements. following somebody across county lines and messaging their new workplace even though they're not even supposed to know where they're at or where they work. Type weird stuff. Sloppy. Absolutely sloppy. But necessary cycle to repeat, because repeating cycles are prosecutable, because then it shows clear motive and clear intent. But what do I know? They brag, they recruit, they overcommunicate, they become visible to the right eyes. And the right eyes had been watching. Not obvious watchers, though. Not the kind that break doors or announce themselves. These guys moved like rumors. A ghost squad, if you will. Some would later call them. Though, that made them sound supernatural when really, they were simply patient, highly placed, and intolerant of men who borrowed authority to prey on civilians. Elite hunters. Truly. A whole squad of top-tier elite ghosts. Quiet, disciplined, following a man's life from the edge of the frame. Keeping him alive by any means so subtle that the group almost mistook it for luck. They were never there to rescue him early. They were there to let the game breathe. To let the circle expand just wide enough to implicate enough, to expose enough, until the case against the group became too ironclad to slip through politics, money, or East Coast favors, no matter how Eastern a star may have been. The man knew they were there, though. He felt them, or perhaps merely behaved as though the possibility of protection was enough. He never looked directly at them, but he knew exactly where they were at all times. That was part of the discipline. But he left things where they could be found. Timelines, slips, contradictions, patterns of contact. He let his enemies believe they were corralling him, while, in truth, he was actually the driver the whole time, guiding them through a dark corridor that had mirrored walls. Each step recording them from a different angle. The girl remained the center of it all, though. But the center was beginning to crack. Debt piled behind her promises. People wanted their share of their money. Share of a fortune that never materialized, nor was it ever going to. The man who had helped her forge identity papers and rerouted assets, they wanted their reassurance. They wanted their money. Their payments. These are not people that you say, I'll give you $1 million to go do this, and just don't pay them. They will come to collect. By all means. Do so. By any means. But it wouldn't be for the person. It's going to be for the one that promised them and lied. The ones who had played enforcers wanted payments for their loyalty. Those who had stolen tactics from military channels and weaponized them against a civilian and wanted proof that the risk had been worth it all the while. She kept stalling, though, spinning new contingencies, inventing fresh delays, assuring them that the man's collapse was imminent any time now. Any time now. The cards say that. She was psychic. She just knew things. She had psychic visions. She was an empress. Wannabe, at best. But each season, he was still there. Damaged, yeah, for sure. But standing. Still impossible to silence, and increasingly difficult to read. Soon, the group's internal conversations changed flavor. What had once been confidence started becoming accusation. Why hadn't he broken? Who had miscalculated? Who'd been talking? Who had failed to execute their part? Why were there so many near misses? So many strange legal setbacks, too. So many moments where it felt like the man had been one step ahead without ever seeming to move. And why? In the last year especially, had small peripheral players begun disappearing from the group's orbit. Not vanishing dramatically, though. Just being quietly pulled away by circumstances that nobody could quite trace. A traffic stop that led to something else. A subpoena tied to a different matter. A financial review by the IRS. A sealed inquiry. A phone seized in a case no one connected to theirs until it was absolutely too late. The machinery of their plot had started eating itself. The astrologer among them was the first to say that the chart looked wrong. But No one admitted to believing her, though. But they listened anyways, because fear makes scholars out of cynics. She spread the printouts across the table one night while the girl smoked through a window she couldn't stop opening and closing. It was Mercury and Aries, she said, tapping the page, voice tight, right there. A mind that moves before the room can lie to it. Speech as ignition. Thoughts as weapons. Then she pointed lower. Mercury square Jupiter in the 6th. A war between language and systems. Exaggeration colliding with routine. A fatal mismatch between what people think they can manage and what their daily operations can actually contain. Over budgeting, not allocating properly, definitely misjudging and underestimating. Nobody spoke. She tapped again. Mercury conjunct Chiron. The wound and the message fused together. The man they were trying to break had turned injury into a decoding system. Every attack had made him more articulate, not less. More precise and more dangerous. Then the cluster of the center unraveled it all. Neptune, Saturn, Mars, Mercury, and Chiron and Aries. A stellium of fire and injury, speech and structure, illusion and force. Strategy born from pain, war hidden inside of clarity. A man attacked so long that he became fluent in attack itself. The girl knocked ash into a crystal dish and said the stars were irrelevant. But when she looked down, her hands were shaken because on some level, all of them understood the same thing. Whatever they had done to him had not simply failed. It had refined him. The man moved through the years like someone being sharpened by impact. The constant threats, the human torture, the attritional cruelty, the attempts to poison every institution around him against him. None of it had made him smaller. Each campaign seemed to strip something unnecessary away from him. He came back leaner, faster, more exact, more precise, more surgical, more articulated, more focused. Less man in the ordinary sense an instrument. If there had once been softness where they could reach him, now there was only a terrifying economy of motion, forward, only forward motion. He spoke rarely, and when he did, people remembered it. He left an imprint on people like no other. He seemed to know where to look in any room. He carried himself with the eerie composure of somebody who had already rehearsed the betrayal before it happened. And still, he played the role that they expected. Just enough. That was how he kept them talking. That was how he kept them from realizing that every forged document, every fake witness, every asset transfer, every threat relayed through intermediaries, every effort to bait him into an overreaction was not just another assault. It was evidence. We'll call it a discovery. Evidence layered against evidence until the whole eastern stretch of their network began to look less like a local scam and more like a sprawling criminal network architecture tied together by vanity, coercion, greed, and the arrogance of people who had mistaken secrecy for invisibility. The girl felt the walls closing before she understood why. First came the calls asking about money that she didn't have, nor was she going to get. Then the quiet distance from the men who had once acted as her shadow. Then a lawyer who stopped returning messages. Then a woman who lied for her, now wanted out. By all costs and any means, she wanted out. Then one of the officials who had abused his role to help steer the campaign suddenly became impossible to reach. His number disconnected, his office under review. It was like internal affairs stepped in or something and started looking deeply into these people that had been, disregarding complaints, disregarding reports, overstepping their power, abuse of power, I believe is what it's called, protecting the dirty. It's just a bad choice. Then another player went missing from the inner circle. Not dead. Worse. Cooperative. Every new development turned the group meaner. They began watching one another the way they had once watched the man. Conversations shortened, old flirtations curdled into suspicion. The same psychological tactics that they had used on him, pressure, implication, controlled panic, loyalty tests, began infecting the group itself. It was like a return to sender, amplified by somebody who factually can manipulate energies. They had built such an effective system of reality distortion that, under stress, it turned inward naturally. By the final year, they were living inside of their own methods, their own machine. They were victims of their own design. That was the genius of the counterintelligence operation that the man had built. He had not simply survived their game, he had led them deeper into it, kept them distracted with his own apparent vulnerability. While the hunters behind the curtain mapped the full lattice of their movements, every threat they made became a breadcrumb. Every attempt to flesh them out revealed who still had access, who still had nerve, who still believed in the pale enough to keep going. When the first public crack finally appeared, it didn't look dramatic. No raid, no headlines, just a filing in a county office that nobody in the group bothered to even read. A procedural thing, a sealed thing. The kind of paper arrogant people ignore because it doesn't announce itself with enough theater. The man noticed it the same day, though. He said nothing. 3 weeks later, one member of the network disappeared into custody. 2 more folded under questioning into separate jurisdictions. A financial trail began to emerge. Then another. Then forged identity records began surfacing in contexts that made coincidence impossible. The courts, which the group had once treated as a stage scenery, started changing temperature around them. Clerks spoke differently. Judges paused longer. Questions began to sharpen like knives. 1,000 daggers at best. Attorneys who had once leaned comfortably into the story now seemed to realize they might have been handling a live wire. The girl tried one last time to revive belief. She called meetings. She made promises. She cried in the right places. She swore the man would still fall. That the case could still be turned. That the old story could still be made to hold if everybody stayed disciplined. But discipline requires shared faith. And by then, even her own reflection seemed unconvinced. The man, meanwhile, simply kept living, minding his own business, moving forward. That was the part that nobody could forgive. He did not announce victory. He did not posture. He did not rage publicly or expose himself in triumph. He made the best of the life that they had tried to destroy. He kept moving in the quiet way that had always infuriated them the most, as if surviving them had become only one task among many. And because he refused spectacle, the truth of what he had done became stranger, darker, and even harder to explain. He had allowed the net to tighten around his own throat and neck, only so the hunters could see the hands pulling the ropes. Surprise. By the time the group understood this, it was way too late. The ghost squad they had never noticed was no longer content just observing. The case was complete enough now, broad enough, patient enough, ugly enough, to matter beyond county gossip and local corruption. What had started as a private attempt to erase one man had become a prosecutable map of conspiracy, identity theft, forgery, coercive control, attempted ruin, abuse of official power, and strategic psychological warfare. The kind of case that just does not simply take down one person. It redraws a region's mythology about who had been untouchable and why, and who was actually untouchable the whole time. People would later call it one of the strongest cases the East Coast had seen in a very, very long time. They would say that the hunters had been brilliant. They would say that the girl had flown too close to greed. They would say the officials who sold fragments of military knowledge to civilians for private war had doomed themselves the moment they mistook a civilian and a citizen for a laboratory. But those who really knew the story said something else. They said the entire empire cracked because one man, under impossible pressure, refused to behave like a victim long enough for evil to finish writing his part. They said he learned to speak back in a language of psy-ops. Then, use that fluency not for chaos, but for evidence. They said he let them think he was drowning while he taught the tide how to count. And when the girl finally understood that the money had never been coming, that all her promises had been a debt she could never, ever pay or no longer roll forward, that the community she had manipulated was beginning to wake, that the courts were no longer a stage but a mouth closing around the truth, she did the only honest thing that she had done in years. She became afraid. Not of prison first, not of exposure, not even of the men she still owed. She became afraid of the man. Because after all the years of trying to drive him insane, trying to kill him by pressure, by fear, by reputation, by paperwork, by social suffocation, by threat and theater, and theft and attrition, he had somehow stayed alive long enough to become the only thing no predator ever wants its prey to become. Patient, observant, unfinished work. And somehow beyond her panic, beyond the crumbling network, beyond the failing script, the hunters were still moving, quiet, surgical, merciless, only in a sense that truth is merciless when it is finally waited long enough. That's all I have for you in this story. Hopefully we're out here making good choices and not trying to ruin people for pay. That would be reckless, especially if they're smarter than you. Have a good day.